Please welcome Kim Hallin.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that nice introduction. I love how quiet it just got. There was a lot of really amazing energy when coming into this room as you all were coming in. So I wanted to take a minute before I start to just ask everybody to put both of your feet on the ground, if you can. Just get grounded. Just get a little centered. Maybe take a breath in. Take a breath out. Let's just all land here. I know you came from all kinds of different places to get here. You have all kinds of things going on later. So I just wanted to make sure that we all just get present and land right here for right now. And as you're sitting in your seat, I want you to really notice the floor beneath your feet and feel the chair underneath you. The floor is supporting your feet and the chair and you. You don't have to do anything to earn that support. It's just here always. And the earth is underneath the floor, supporting all of that, supporting all of us all the time. And I can really feel the energy settle as we did that exercise, and I appreciate that, and I hope you do too. And the reason I wanted to start with that is because the message that I have for you today is one that I really believe has to be received not just from the thinking brain, which is where we humans live a lot of the time, but also from the body brain, which includes the heart and includes the gut, the intuition. There's another brain there. Did you know that? And that's really the brain of life, even more so sometimes than the thinking brain. So as I get into my presentation today and the question and answers, I want you to see if you can stay connected to your body brain as well, to your heart and your gut. All right? So my name is Kim. I was invited here because I'm the author of a book called Horse Wisdom, Life Lessons for Humanity. But it's interesting because when I got invited to speak as an author, a little bit of imposter syndrome kind of crept in. You all know what that is? Yeah. It's because Horse Wisdom is the only book I've ever written. And if you see it here, it's a small book, not a very big book, and it's a self-published book. And when I think about authors who get invited to give talks, that's not really what my vision is. So a little bit of imposter syndrome creeps in. But what I do believe wholeheartedly is that this little book does deserve to be recognized and to be promoted. And here's why. Because the horses who inspired me to write the book don't have a voice or a platform in our human world of their own. And so they need those of us who are willing to talk about the sometimes ethereal experiences we have with horses that connect us with their deeper wisdom. They rely on us to be able to share these stories. And that's what my book is about. And I'm going to share a little bit of that in my presentation today, if I can get this going. So, this is me and my friend Rayleigh Cario. We call him Rayleigh for short. Oh, maybe I'll move over here. And this picture was taken almost a year ago exactly. And this was the day that the first printed copy of Horse Wisdom arrived in my mailbox. I went straight from the mailbox out to the pasture to share it with the horses, and Rayleigh Cario came walking right up to me, and you can see him trying to pose with me for this picture. I think he was as excited as I was. And even though when the book was published, I knew that I didn't really have a lot of time, certainly didn't have a lot of money to promote the book, I had this feeling in my heart that it was the beginning of something really big. And it's interesting that a year later, just this past week, Rayleigh Cario and I were highlighted in an article in Garden and Gun magazine. Are you familiar with Garden and Gun magazine? Yeah, it's quite a nice publication, isn't it? And we got highlighted in it because the author of the article, her name is Ashley Bell Peterson, and she's actually a much more successful up-and-coming book author than I am. She's the author of a novel called Crocodile Bride. If you haven't heard of it or read it, it's a very good novel, so I highly recommend that. But she actually and her mother came out to my business about a year ago. Well, it was in November of 2021. And they had what she called a life-changing experience in the pasture with Rayleigh Cario. And so this article, if you want to look for it in Garden and Gun magazine, tells about her story and her experience in the pasture with Rayleigh. So just a little bit about my business. I live on a small 3-acre horse farm Ravenel, South Carolina. My business is called Unbridled, and I focus on half-day or 3-hour retreats. And I work with individuals or couples, small groups, families, corporate teams, anybody who's interested in coming out. And it's really nature-based experiential learning. Now, it does focus a lot on horses. Horses are the core of my business, but they're not the only animals at my farm. If you look to the right corner, I have a pot-bellied pig, Bartholomew the pig. And we also have a menagerie of reptiles. We have turtles, tortoises, snakes, and bearded dragons as well. So lots of different avenues for experiential learning and nature-based connection. But there's a theme that runs through my business and my book. And that underlying theme is that our true nature as humans is to be at home in nature. We often don't think about that, do we? Humans often think of ourselves as quite separate from the animal kingdom. And sometimes we like to think of ourselves as above the animal kingdom. But the truth is that our ancestors evolved right beside their ancestors. And many of the species that our ancestors evolved next to are still sharing the planet with us. Some aren't. And some aren't because of us. So it's complicated, isn't it? But we're not so separate. All of us are governed by the laws of nature. We might not think about that a lot as human beings, but anytime there's a big storm, things that are out of our control, we're reminded, aren't we, that we aren't in control of everything. There are a lot of things outside of our human society, human laws, that govern the way we live and should govern the way we live if we're wise. And that's where the horse and human relationship gets really interesting, at least to me. Because horses and humans are very different species, but we share a very unique experience. And that's the experience of both being more powerful together than we are apart. And yet, both of our species also now find ourselves often systemically oppressed by the very civilizations and societies that our partnership made possible. I'm going to repeat that. It's a really profound statement. Horses and humans are the only two species that have the unique experience of learning together that we are more powerful together than we are apart. And yet, both of our species today often find ourselves systemically oppressed by the very civilizations, modern civilizations, that our partnership made possible. We know that humanity would not be where we are today without horses. Horses are what initially allowed our very, very separate and isolated human communities to access each other, to travel distances that we couldn't travel by foot. We relied on horses for travel, transportation, hunting, mail delivery, warfare, farming, all kinds of things throughout our history. We don't rely on them for all those things anymore, which is interesting. But we did. And what the horse-human relationship and horse wisdom reminds me most of all today is that we're all part of the healthiest and most intelligent herd on the planet, which is the community of all life. In my book, I tell some really personal stories about my transformational experiences with horses in my life. A lot of these experiences are kind of ethereal. They do border on the spiritual, right? They're not your everyday stories about accomplishments on horseback. They are about the emotional intelligence of horses and how horses have helped me see aspects of myself and aspects of society in ways that I've never been able to see it through human lenses alone. And the book is divided into 17 life lessons, which are probably hard to read there, but these life lessons are actually the ones that the horses themselves asked me to share with others. The ones that the horses told me were the most important to start a new conversation with humanity. And when I horses themselves told me. That may make you believe that I'm some kind of animal communicator, or that I believe I'm some sort of animal communicator. But here's the thing. Humanity does not have a monopoly on communication. And in fact, the human species came along pretty late in the evolutionary game. And I promise you, there was a lot of interspecies communication going on before we got here. And certainly before our modern human languages were devised. As for horses and humans, there's a lot of documentation that our two species have coexisted for more than 4 million years. It's a really long time. And that our ancestors and their ancestors walked many of the same paths in ancient territories, right? So we lived near each other, and we walked the same paths, and we traveled the same areas. And it's believed that horses and humans developed a shared language, a kinetic or kinesthetic language that was based in empathy, derived from observing one another, observing the movements, observing the behaviors, the mannerisms, choices, the body language of one another. All without spoken language. And this is still, for those of you, how many of you have had experience with horses? Yeah. Those of you who have, you know that horses speak the language of body language and energy, don't you? It's really important when you're interacting with a horse that you're grounded and you're aware of what your body's doing, what you're emitting, your energy and intention. That is the universal language of life. And humans and horses probably first connected through that language. But the bottom line is, we all communicate with animals. We all do, at some level, right? Because, guess what? We are animals. Human beings are animals. Right? We are not that separate. So this is me. This is me and my pig. I think maybe I'm just human, but anyway, this is me and Bartholomew the pig. We call him Bart. How many of you knew that we share 98% of our DNA with pigs? A few of you knew that. 98% of our DNA with pigs. That's a high percentage, isn't it? And I can guarantee you. So Bart, I never really planned to have a pig. Bart actually showed up on my farm as a stray piglet. He was the size of a chihuahua. Tiny little piglet. And he would not leave. I couldn't find anybody who owned him, nobody who would claim him. And within 3 days, as a tiny piglet, I'm guessing he was 5 or 6 weeks old, he learned to speak horse fluently in 3 days. He is absolutely the smartest, most emotionally intelligent animal on my farm, including me. Right? He's an incredible being. He really is. So we share 98% of our DNA with pigs. We also share, I think it is 70 or 75% of our DNA with slugs. And 55% of our DNA with bananas. So there's a lot of commonalities in all of life. We tend to focus on the little differences, and a lot of those differences are visual differences, like we look different, right? But there's a lot that's similar, a lot of DNA that's shared in all of life. And this is a key message I want you to take away today, and that's that within our very DNA, within your DNA, you already have all of the intelligence you need, all of the knowledge you need to speak the universal language of life. You have the DNA within you to communicate with birds, horses, trees. There are similarities. There are ways that we're alike. There's parts of our DNA that know each other and recognize each other. So Horse Wisdom, the book, is my invitation, not just from the horses in my life, but from what I call the horse collective, which is the entire species of horses. who have actually literally carried our species, literally and figuratively, for thousands of years. And they have been waiting patiently for us to come full circle through all the ways that we've relied on horses, for us to come full circle. And now we're at a place where we don't need to use them the way that we always have. We can finally start seeing them again. Start seeing the whole of who they are. Start seeing all the things they have to offer us besides just what we need from them. Although there's a lot that a book will tell you we do need from them. And it's not things that we don't know, it's things that we've forgotten. It's things that horses help us remember about ourselves, about life, about living on an interconnected and interdependent planet. So horse wisdom is my invitation from them for you to start thinking about things again in a little bit different way. And again, not just thinking, but feeling your way to some different understandings. And I want to kind of end, my formal part of the presentation is short because I really wanted to leave a lot of time for questions and answers and discussion. But I wanted to end with these images of the two horses that I dedicated my book to. On the left you have Shoki. He's the bay with the white blaze. And he is a horse that shared my life with me for over 20 years. Not since he was a baby. He came to me. He was already about 10 or 12 when he came into my life. But he was with me for a long time. He lived to the ripe old age of 32. And he was the herd elder in my herd for a long time. And Shoki passed away. Well, I should say, he allowed me to walk him home in January of 2020. And so he passed in January of 2020. And then in March of 2020, I got sick with COVID, very early in the COVID pandemic. And I wasn't hospitalized, but I got pretty sick. And at that time, it wasn't even really believed that it was in South Carolina. So it was very hard to get tested. It was kind of a long process. And then during those months when the country and Charleston were going into lockdown, and I was self-isolating because I was sick and I didn't know for how long was I contagious. And I started spending a lot of time while I was recovering, every day, just sitting in the pasture with the horses. And this is where I remembered about grounding, about being connected to the earth, about listening to the birds. And it was so peaceful and so healing for me emotionally and physically to just be at peace with them in the pasture. And they reminded me that everything was still okay in the world. As much as the human world seemed crazy and like it was going nuts, everything in the natural world was still operating as it should be. They were still present and enjoying life every day. And that was super healing for me. And it was during that time when I was really quiet in the pasture with him that I felt Shoki nudging my shoulder. And he was saying, "You've always thought about writing a book. Now's the time. We need you to write a book. And humanity needs this wisdom now more than it ever has at this crazy time. Now's the time you need to write this book." And how could I not listen to him? But it still took me quite a while to get the courage, right? And to realize that actually writing a book, even a little book, is a huge endeavor. I like to write blogs and things like that, but writing a book is a different kind of project, right? And I realized I really didn't know what I was doing. And so, very interestingly, so Shoki passed in January of 2020. Marcus was with me through that whole next year. And then Marcus passed suddenly in March of 2021. Actually, yesterday was the 2-year anniversary of his passing. And it was 3 weeks before Marcus passed that I signed the book contract with my book coach. I knew I needed someone to help me get this done because I didn't know what I was doing writing a book and publishing a book. So I hired a book coach, and it was a 12-month contract. They said, we're going to have it done in 12 months, one way or the other. And it was right after I had signed that contract that Marcus passed. And so these two horses were with me in my spirit herd every day while I wrote this book. They were the ones that guided me, along with my 3 other horses that are still living and still at my farm. And if you read the book, they're going to be with you too. And And it's because of them that I'm excited every time I get the opportunity to come talk about the book. Because it's not so much about me as it is about helping them have their voices heard. And I'll be selling the book afterwards if you're interested. It's available on Amazon, so don't feel like you need to buy it today if you want to read it. And also on my website, which is www.kimhallin.com. You go there and go to a tab that says books. You can actually, if you like to read online, you can download a free PDF copy. So I want the book to be available to as many people as possible, whatever form they want. So I'd love to just hear what came up for some of you during any of that. Was there anything that resonated for you or that stood out for you? Yes?
How long have you been a horse person and realized that they have something to tell us?
Great. That's a great question. And there's no short answer for that question. Her question was, how long have I been a horse person? And how long have I known that they have wisdom to teach us, to share? So the answer to that is, for whatever reason, I was born loving horses. I did not grow up in a family with horses. I was born in St. Petersburg, Florida. I had a distant relative who had a horse farm in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I visited there twice as a child. What are the reasons that some of us are born loving horses? I don't really have an answer for that, but I was. And my only exposure to horses was through kind of the traditional ways. I learned how to ride at Girl Scout summer camp. And an interesting thing is that I was a very sensitive, kind of intuitive child, right? Maybe an empath. And I really just wanted to connect with the horses. But at the camp, we had things we had to do. We were there to learn to ride. And I remember distinctly one of the times as a child when the horse I was riding, and you can imagine, summer camp's not necessarily the most fun life on a horse, right? Lots of different kids getting on, doing beginner lessons, teaching kids that don't really know how to ride. And the horse I was on really wasn't interested in doing what we were trying to do that day. And I remember being told, you need to kick her harder, right? Put the crop in your hand. And I remember that it didn't feel comfortable. But what that did for me is it made me feel like I was not a good leader. Like there was something missing in me that I couldn't make this horse do something she didn't want to do. I didn't really understand it all at the time. But when I look back on it later, I realized that a lot of people, a lot of kids get into horses because we're just drawn to their beautiful souls, their spirituality is majestic about them. But the only access in today's world that we have to horses is through the traditional means. Unless you happen to be lucky enough to grow up on a horse farm and can just go sit in the pasture with them like I do. Or you happen to live in the few places out west where there are still some wild herds and you maybe get to observe actual wild herds. Most of us only have access to horses through riding programs, farms, carriage rides downtown. We see them on TV. I used to love watching horse racing as a kid. Anything that had to do with horses, I loved. And because I kind of then got indoctrinated in the way we work with horses, and I just then took on the mindset. I wanted to become the best horsewoman I could, because that's how you get to have a living with horses, right? So I got focused on becoming the best rider I could, and then later on the best trainer I could. I picked my college in North Carolina because it had an equestrian program. I didn't have enough money to ride on the team, but you could take horseback riding for PE credit. And so I did that for 4 years. And it was my senior year in college, I had a horrific riding accident. It was kind of a freak accident. We were riding in a backfield, but there was trees, a wood line around both sides of the field. And there were some dogs in the woods. And the theory is, at a lot of places, that the more horses you ride, the better a rider you become. Right? Because lots of different horses are different. So you would go, you'd show up, and you would see which horse you were listed, your lesson was listed by. You'd go get that horse out of the pasture, saddle it up, and take your lesson. And you may not ride that horse again, either ever, or maybe not for months. There were over 100 horses at this facility. And the horse that I rode that day, I didn't know anything about. And nobody told me that he had been laid up for an injury. So he'd been on stall rest for a couple months. This was his first time out, which makes the horse a little edgy, right? They've been cooped up. So he was amped up, and I was a little nervous, and we were walking along the tree line, and there were dogs in the woods. You couldn't see them, but we could hear them. And I could hear them ahead of us, and I could feel my horse's body tense. And so we were going toward it, and I was getting tense and just trying to be like, let's get through this. And we got past the dogs, and I relaxed. I thought, oh good, we're past it. I hadn't really been taught what it means to be a prey animal. A prey animal, if you're a horse in the wild, and you think there might be wolves or a tiger or a lion in the woods, and they're mostly going to jump out behind you, and they're going to jump on your back. And so we got past the dogs, and the noise started behind the horse, and he panicked. And he did one of these, he dropped, he jumped to the side, and I lost the reins and the stirrup, and I was kind of hanging off of him, and he bolted, and at a full gallop. And I was kind of hanging on, but I didn't have rein, I didn't have any way to control what was happening. And this was a cross-country field, and he was running me like, if this was a jump, he was running me right toward the jump. Not like he was going to go over it, but the way I was hanging off, I was going to smash into the jump. So I made a split-second decision to bail. And I bailed off the side of him at a full gallop. I had a helmet on, thankfully, but the way that I landed, my head bounced, and I snapped the bone at the very top of the neck. Literally broke my neck. And I'm blessed to be here today standing in front of you with all faculties, right? I was very, very lucky. But things changed for me after that. I really didn't have any fear. You know, kids, young people, we don't have any fear. I wasn't afraid of any of the horses I rode until that happened. And the other thing that's interesting is in the horse industry, you're encouraged to push through your fear. And I wanted to get back on. I wanted to get back to the horses because I loved them. But after the accident, my body healed. But when I got back on, for the first time, I had fear. And the rides, as I got on each time, I was like, I just want to get through it and be done. Because I knew it was just a matter of time until another accident might happen. So I didn't enjoy the ride the way that I had. I started, you couldn't tell from the outside, I got a lot of commendations for how brave I was to get back on and keep going, but the joy had gone out of it a little bit for me. So it wasn't until years later, until I was 30, that I got my own horse. And that was when finally I had the freedom to say, I just want to be in a relationship with this horse. So then I started on a quest of how can I do it a different way? But I still really didn't understand. So I went through lots of different training methods, all the different positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, clicker training, a program called CAT-H, lots of different training programs to try to become the best trainer I could. And then this is a long story, but I bred a horse, one of my mares, because I wanted to, ultimate if you're a horse person is you want to raise a horse from birth and train it to be your perfect partner, right? So I had that goal, and my ex-husband and I bred the mare, and Tempo is the foal. She still lives on my farm now. She's 16 now. And from the day that Tempo was born, her lesson for me has been, do not plan somebody else's life for them. She was not on board with my plan for her. I had our life planned out. Nothing went according to plan, including a developmental bone disorder in the bone in her hoof when she was a yearling. And she then had to be confined for almost 8 months for rehab. And during that time, I was still working. One of my former coworkers, Jerry, is back here. I used to work at Trident Tech, and I was still working. And I had to get up and give her injections and medications before I went to work. And she was in the stall, and so I just had to get it done, right? I didn't understand that here was a prey animal who I had taken away her primary mechanism for safety, which is flight. She was confined in a stall, and I had to go in and give her injections, medications. She didn't understand what was happening. She didn't like it. She just knew I wasn't letting her out. So she became very aggressive. Horses, we all have fight or flight response. All of us do. And if the flight response is shut down, the only alternative really is fight. So this was a very tough 8 months. And I can tell you I got hurt a few times by her. And I thought that when I let her back out, that she would return to her more normal state. But it didn't. Trauma changes us, especially at a young age. She had now started to associate humans with the loss of her bodily autonomy. She didn't want humans really coming anywhere near her body. She would prefer we didn't ever touch her, because her experience had not been very positive about that, right? And so she actually became very defensive. When I let her out of the pasture, If anybody came to the fence and wanted to come in, she wanted to keep you out of the whole pasture. She didn't want you messing with her or any of her herd mates. All the training I had learned, none of the training was able to fix this problem. And the reason is because she wasn't broken. She was hurt. She was traumatized. And the way that led me to where I am now is the only way to heal the relationship with her, because I was unwilling to send her to a trainer that would break her spirit. I had bred her, I had raised her from a baby. I knew she was not a mean horse in her heart, that had come out because of her experiences. So what I had to learn was that anytime she told me with her body language, no, I'm not comfortable, don't come any closer, I had to stop. I had to say, I hear you. And I'll step back. And you tell me when you're ready or how you want to interact. That was really hard because it went against everything I had been taught about being a trainer, where you fix the problems in the horse, you modify their behavior, you change it. It was a process of healing with her. And in that process, I had to learn how to read really subtle horse body language, because she could go from seemingly fine to really aggressive like in a split second. It seemed like that at first, until I started to realize the little wrinkles around her nose were telling me something. Position of her ear, how she was swishing her tail. I could learn to see the tension in her muscles or not, just when she was standing still. I started to learn how to look for these things as she was trying to communicate with me all the time how she felt, and I just wasn't seeing it before. So that was how I started listening. And then when I started listening to her, of course, I got curious about what my other horses were saying. And their body language was a lot more subtle. We learn, they learn how to behave. They learn how to get along in human society. And a lot of them learn what not to say, at least not very loudly. But if you start looking for what they're saying beneath the surface, you can see it. And once I started really listening and asking them questions, it just changed everything for me. And I luckily had the freedom at that time to be able to say, I want to explore what life is like with horses if I do it differently. And so part of what my business is about now is all about just allowing people to come out and have a completely different experience with horses than any other experience you can find anywhere. Right? No lead ropes, no saddles, no anything. We just go in the pasture, we observe them, we learn about their relationships with each other, and we learn how to be in relationship with them organically. It's really beautiful. So that's the long, long answer to your question. Yes?
Now that we no longer depend on horses for what were traditional uses, what is the future of horses? As you can probably attest, they're not real cheap pets.
It's a wonderful question. So he asked, now that we do not rely on horses the way that we used to in the past, what is the future with horses, especially given that they are not cheap to keep? Another big thing I'm trying to do with my business is to show that I can actually have a sustainable business. I can support myself and my horses without riding, without training, without many of these traditional uses. And the truth is, in the horse industry, a lot of horses get broken down at a young age. There are many unrideable horses, but they can still be beautiful contributors to our society and our health and our well-being. The future is in question because the horse industry, like any industry, is really well established. And there's a lot of talk within the industry right now about what's called the social license to operate. And this has ramifications here in Charleston. Most of you are probably aware about the debates with the carriage industry. It's not just that industry. Every sector of the horse industry is currently having a lot of internal and external debate about what is ethical, what is humane, what isn't. And those are great questions we should be asking. And I'm not someone who's like, no one should ever ride a horse. I think it's much more complicated than that. I go to barns where I visit that our horses are kept in stalls, and absolutely the best part of their day is when their human who loves them shows up and takes them out for a ride. So it is not as easy as saying riding's bad or something's good. We really have to look at all the levels of this and say each horse is an individual, each relationship is an individual, and how do we find what works best given what we have to work with. But a big part of it is having people who have the courage to try to say there are ways that we can build businesses that are built on a different way of being in relationship with horses that can help us afford them. think there's also probably ways that there could be communal herds, where many people who own horses have them live together in bigger herds, and the community gets to come and interact with them in different ways. I think there's lots of creative options. We're just pretty stuck in the way that we've been thinking about how things are. And it's even within the horse industry where there's probably as much or more resistance to change. And that's just fear-based. When you have a business that's based on the way things are done, it's very scary to think about making changes. And my livelihood might go by the wayside. So this is something that's going to be, I think, take time to change, if we choose to.
Yes, I have two older grandsons, like 14. And so what would be if I wanted to bring them out there for a morning or an afternoon? How does that work?
How does that work? So her question is, she has grandsons, you said? Like 14 age, and she was asking if she wanted to bring them out, what would that look like? So the main part of my program is what I call them 3-hour retreats. And the reason it's 3 hours is because when you do things on horse time, and we're trying to get down to like being present with nature, you don't do it in an hour. And horses are not like dogs. They take a little while to warm up and to explore. And so 3 hours ends up being the perfect amount of time where we get to have really meaningful experiences, and yet people aren't really ready for it to be over. Believe it or not, 3 hours goes really fast in the pasture. So it's typically 3 hours. And I have different pricing structures for 1 or 2 people. So it's individuals or couples, and a couple could be any 2 people. The cost is $250 for that 3-hour experience. For a family up to 6, it's $500, and then it goes up depending on the size of the group. But I also actually have a program, an outreach program called the Urban Equine Connection Program, where I partner with quite a few nonprofits in the area, and we also look for private sponsors so that we can bring children and families who maybe can't afford the normal prices to come out and have the experiences. So it's really important to me. I need to have a sustainable business, right, and support myself and the horses, but I also do want to make it accessible to those who can't afford the prices for the experience. Who else has a question? Yes.
In general, in the United States, is the horse population increasing or decreasing?
That's a good question. I think worldwide the horse population is increasing. And the horse industry is oddly a growing industry, even though we don't use horses in the ways that we used to anymore. The industry it's created a life of its own, and a lot of the industry is in breeding and training. So there's a very big market for expensive sport horses and babies, and to have them trained. What isn't equal is what happens on the back end. Where do these horses go when they need to be retired? When someone wants to trade in the BMW of a horse to get another BMW, and this older horse now needs a new job or a new life. So there is also, I hate to even bring it up, but there is actually a vibrant horse slaughter industry. It's not legal in the U.S. There's no slaughterhouses in the U.S. anymore, but we do participate in selling horses for slaughter, and then they're transported over borders and out to sea. So you may or may not know that, but horses are still eaten in some parts of the world, and horse meat is used for dog food and things like that. I don't like to bring up these subjects, but I think we ought to know what the whole totality of the industry is that we participate in, and it's not always just the pretty parts that we see. There's a lot of baby horses being born every year, millions, right? And there's not always enough homes for all of them. Yes?
Can you give us an illustration of how the horses inspired you to write one of your chapters?
When I first wrote the book, I really just wanted to give the lessons. So it's wonderful that you'd asked that question. And my book coach read the first version of my book, and she said, well, it's interesting, but I want to know, like, how did the horses teach you that lesson? So I had to tell some really personal stories. And I almost stopped writing the book at that point, because a lot of the stories I do talk about animal communication in some of these. I do talk about the very troubling experience it was for me when I went through the experience with Tempo of realizing that she was traumatized because of things I had done, even though I love her. I had tried to take the best care I could of her. I took care of her physically, but I didn't take care of her emotional needs. I didn't recognize what was going on with her emotionally and what that did for me. But learning to allow Tempo to say no to me, this is one of the stories I talk about in the book. There was a mirror going on in my own life. I had a lot of codependency. I was in a very unhealthy marriage. I didn't know that I was allowed to say no, to have boundaries, to say what was okay or not okay in my life for people who are in relationship with me. And by learning to let her tell me no, she gave me the courage to make some really profound changes in my own life. So that's just one example. So sometimes it's from watching the horses, things I learned from them, but a lot of it is about things I learned in my personal journey of being in relationship differently with horses. Because if I'm going to be in relationship with them differently, I have to be in relationship with myself and the rest of the world around me differently. It changes everything. Yes?
There was a show on 60 Minutes, I think, recently about the Department of Interior in Wyoming. They
Yes.
round up wild horses.
Yes.
But they turned them over to a prison farm run by the penitentiary system in Wyoming.
Yes.
And honor prisoners were allowed to train these horses, and then they were sold to
Yes.
people. Did you happen to see that?
I didn't see that one, but actually there are several of those programs in the US, and that's a wonderful way of thinking outside the box, right? And trying to figure out new ways of being. So he was telling me about a special he saw where some of the wild horses, they get rounded up because there's population control issues with that. And then some of those horses are chosen and sent to certain penitentiaries that have programs where the inmates learn how to train the horses. So they're gaining skills, not only like maybe a marketable skill to become horse trainers, but also a lot of the interpersonal skills that I'm talking about. They're learning about how to control their own anger and their temper and their energy and things like that by working with the horses. And then those horses get sold to loving homes. So that's a very creative alternative program that's out there.
I just wanted to ask you about the carriage horses downtown seem to be a rather controversial subject.
Yes.
What's your opinion on that particular arrangement?
So it's really interesting. And my short answer to that is that I would prefer to keep the conversation at a completely different level, because it's not just the carriage industry where that's the one that's most public, right, in Charleston. It's most public facing. A lot of what goes on in the horse industry is not seen in the public. So I'm going to tell you that because those horses, that industry is monitored more closely than almost any other industry. And talking about the social license to operate, they are at the front and center of it. Those horses have to be well cared for physically, right? They have to be well monitored. And so there's a lot of stuff going on in other sectors of the industry that would concern me even more than what's happening there. But at the larger scale, if you're actually looking at horses as sentient beings, we have to ask, is it even appropriate for humanity to say horses need to have jobs being defined by our human world, that they have to earn their right to be here? They're only expensive because we have to keep them. There's not a way for them to live wild anymore, right? So there's a much higher conversations that I think we ought to be thinking about and having. And when we get stuck at this, like, this industry is bad, or certain aspect of it, I think it's distracting us from some of the larger conversations and the ability to envision some completely different possibilities for the future. If that makes sense.
What about horse whisperers?
It's a term. It's a term for people who I think are really tuned in to this universal language of energy and intention. We're not really special. We've just tuned in to this more energetic way of interacting with other beings. So I really think they're just speaking the universal language of life and with horses.
Do you do your own veterinary care?
Yes, she asked, do I do my own veterinary care? And no, I do not. So I do have an equine vet. I have a pig vet as well. I did trim my own horse's feet for a time, partly because Tempo wouldn't allow anyone else to touch her feet. So I had to learn to do that. But there is the same thing that's common in the human industry, which I think a lot of people who are navigating the healthcare system get frustrated that there's not always a holistic approach. Right? There's a specialist for this and a specialist for that, and we're treating this and we're treating that, but we're not always looking at the body as a whole. The same thing is happening in the veterinary industry, and it's the same challenge. So I struggle with some of that, although I do have a wonderful horse vet here locally. Yes.
My daughter's godson is got a lot of emotional and mental issues. The only thing he has been successful at in the world is horse therapy. And he rode his horse for 3 months and became very successful. He and the horse love each other. He can communicate with that horse, but he can't communicate with the world. I wonder what you think about horse therapy.
Yeah, I think horse therapy is a wonderful thing. One of the ways that we're going to open doors to new ways of being with horses. I will say that some of the trends I'm seeing in equine therapy that we have to be careful about, because the more it becomes an industry, the more popular it becomes, and people are trying to do this many lessons every day, a lot of times the horses end up being as a tool the same way they do in other lessons. So I'm an advocate for trying to work with folks in that industry as well, that we make sure we remember that the horses are also sentient beings, and how do we make the program work for both. But yes, there are many people who have had tremendous breakthroughs through equine therapy, and I'm a big proponent of that industry.
Can you tell whether some horses just don't like some people?
Sure. But I don't know that horses, that's actually a really interesting question. She asked, can you tell that horses just don't like some people? I don't think horses have idea of like we do. I like you or don't like you. Horses are with you in the moment. If they are comfortable with your energy, they are drawn to you in that moment. If your energy changes, they will not be drawn to you anymore in that moment. And I've even seen horses who have had really quite traumatic experiences with a particular human. And if that human makes the effort to change their energy, their vibration, their intention, the horse will respond differently to them, right? Now, if something triggers the old trauma, they will respond to that. They do have trauma like we do. But I'm not sure that they like people or make that judgment about you just in general. They are very present with whatever's going on with you. There's certain energies they're put off by, though, for sure. Yes?
One more question and then.
Yeah, okay.
What is the size of your herd, and what determines whether you expanded or you lost 2 horses? How do you
Great.
judgment?
You guys are asking amazing questions. So she asked, what is the size of my herd now, and how do I decide when to increase it or not? The biggest my herd has ever been, my farm is only 3 acres. That is a small property for managing horses. And I have to do a lot of extra work. I have to rotate the pastures and able to keep grass growing, and I have some sacrifice areas that are just dirt. So when it rains, so I have to do a lot of management to keep grass growing, because I like my horses to live as naturally as possible, even on a small acreage. So when I had 5, that was a big herd. But it was the most interesting herd to engage with from an experiential learning program because it was a more natural herd. Now I have 3, although I call it my spirit herd because their energy is still there. And it has been fascinating. The answer to if or when I expand the herd again is when the horses tell me. Because it's their life and their home. And it's been challenging when I've brought horses in that they didn't choose. In the wild, horses are very selective about who they form family bands with. And so, especially on a small farm, when I bring in a horse, I want to make sure that it's a good fit with the horse community as well. And right now, my horses having lost 2 members of their herd in 2 years, it's been a lot of transition. And I could tell you whole stories about how they have dealt with grief and dying and death and loss and transition. But the biggest lesson they've taught me is that when we lose someone who's critical in our sphere, it changes our all the other relationships. Everybody is redefining themselves and redefining their relationships with each other. And so I think there's been too much change. They are just now starting to really feel settled again as a herd of 3. And I feel the energy I've been getting from them is that they don't want any more change right now. And so we're just staying as it is for right now.